Good evening. This is a meeting of the Athens Board of Zoning Appeals. The City of Athens and the Athens City Board of Zoning Appeals supports the Americans with Disability Act. Anyone needing special accommodation may make such requests at this time. The time is 7 p.m. and the date is October 9, 2007. At this time, I will call the meeting to order. The board consists of 5 members and 2 alternates. The alternates take full part in the discussions and become a voting member in the absence of a member or when a member absentees of the conflict of interest. Present tonight are members Ms. Betty Hollow, Mr. Roger Gruser, Mr. Hector Flores, and Ms. Michelle Draybold. Ms. Draybold is going to act as a regular member tonight. Also present are zoning administrator Steve Pearson, and we do not have Mr. Paul Eschenbacher for the as a secretary.
He's taking the minutes.
Okay. Also present is the Athens City Prosecutor, Mr. Mike Miller. The board operates according to the following procedure. 1, the chair will name and describe the case. 2, the zoning administrator will state the basis of the objection and any applicable facts or conditions pertaining to the case. Number 3, the appellant or their representative will give reason why the appeal should be viewed favorably. Number 4, anyone wishing to speak in favor of the request will be heard. 5, anyone wishing to speak in general comments will be heard. 6, anyone wishing to speak in opposition will be heard. If necessary, the appellant or their representatives will offer concluding summary or rebuttal remarks. 8, testimony from the floor shall be closed. The board will deliberate and render a decision. According to the Athens City Code, Section 230703B, the board has power to grant variances from the strict application of the code, provided the variance will not be contrary to the public interest. The spirit of the code is observed, public safety and welfare are secured, and substantial justice is done. According to the Athens City Code, Section 230910C, variances from the code shall not be granted unless the board finds, based on direct specific findings of the fact, that each of the following conditions have been supported. Practical difficulty and undue hardship. Because of exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions pertaining to a specific piece of property, a literal enforcement of these regulations will result in practical difficulty or undue hardship that is unnecessary to the achievement of public purposes. Exceptional circumstances. There are exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions applying to the property in question or to the intended use of the property that do not apply generally to other properties or classes or uses in the same zone. Preservation or equal property rights. Literal interpretation of these regulations would deprive the appellant of rights commonly enjoyed by others in the same zone and the same vicinity, while the granting of the requested variance will not confer on the applicant any special privilege that is denied to other properties in the same zone and the same vicinity. Minimum variance. The variance granted is the minimum variance required to make possible the reasonable use of the property. Absence of detriment. The authorizing of such variance will not be substantial detriment to the adjacent property and will not materially impair the purpose of the zoning code or the public interest. Not of a general nature. The condition or situation of the specific piece of property or the intended use of said property for which variance is sought, one or the other in the combination, is not of such a general or recurrent nature as to make reasonably practicable the formation of a general regulation for such condition or situation. The board also has the power to review decisions of the zoning administrator where an error is alleged. I think since we don't have that section, I guess I'm going to skip that part. There is only one case tonight on the agenda. And the board is required to take testimony under oath. Would anyone wishing to speak concerning any item on the agenda, please stand and swear or affirm that any testimony you will present to the board will be of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Our only case is case number 07-15V for variance, property at 38 North Court Street, and zone is B2D. Wasserman Group LLC and is the appellant. The appellant is requesting a variance from section 2311, table B, office street parking requirements to permit residential occupancy of a structure with 3 on-site and 7 off-site parking spaces where 10 on-site parking spaces are required. At this point, I would like to ask Mr. Pearson to give us a briefing of the case, please.
My name's Steve Pearson. I'm a zoning administrator for the City of Athens, Ohio, and I have been sworn in. I provided each of you with a packet of information. There were some photos that were in those that were black and white, and I have distributed the color pictures that accompanied the application for you to look at. The packet contains the refusal, the original refusal. Then you should have a drawing that indicates where the property is located. This is a property that the board has heard within the last year, has heard a case regarding this property on 2 other occasions. So this is the 3rd occasion for a review of this particular property. There's just a very basic sketch of what the 2nd floor residential use is proposed to look like. And probably some of these documents you've seen with other applications for this same property. There's another drawing that shows the 3 on-site parking spaces that are available. They're around the corner on Mill Street. This property is L-shaped and actually fronts on Mill Street and on North Court Street. I just did a real quick aerial photograph to show you where the parking for the additional 7 spaces is located at. I'd like to point out too, Mr. Wasserman in his application said it was 1,950 feet, and I've indicated 2,200, but it's right. I mean, it is what it is, around 2,000 feet. I just really quickly use GIS to make the measurement. Also in your packet is the points on which Mr. Wasserman is basing his appeal, so you do have that document that's required to be submitted. There's a copy of a lease option for the 7 parking spots at 175 Mill Street, which is a parking lot just before the intersection of North McKinley and Mill Street, down on the right-hand side as you were headed east toward the river. And there was 1 letter of support that was received, and you had that in your packet also. The parking requirements in the B2D zone for commercial uses are met by the city parking garage, so there is no commercial parking requirement. Any on-site parking spaces in the current B2D zone can be counted toward a parking requirement for residential use. So that's where you come up with the 3. I believe one of the proposals you'd heard before actually asked for stack parking because you can, in reality, get more than 3 cars in that space. However, stack parking is not permitted to be counted toward the parking requirement. All of those spaces have to be accessible in order to be counted. So there's no request for a variance for stacked or trapped parking. Really, I guess besides that, unless you have any questions, then I can answer. That's just the documents related to the case.
There is a question on the distance, and there is also a question on these spaces are not in the same name of the owner. They are leased, right? These 7 spaces are leased, but not in the same name of the owner of the property, so it's not deeded to this property.
That's correct. One in the parking code, it says that you can meet the parking requirement if the spots are on-site or they are in the same ownership, deed restricted, and within 250 feet.
Okay.
So in this case, that's there's no ability to do that. Mr. Wasserman doesn't own parking spaces that he can deed restrict within 250 feet. So the request is just for a variance to have that parking off-site rather than on-site or in same ownership or deed restricted.
Is there any, being relatively new to the board, is there any precedent that has been set for this distance?
I'm not sure what the distances have been for parking variances. I know since the parking requirement was changed, the board's probably heard about 50 cases regarding parking variance. Now, I'll give you an example. I'm not sure how far it is from Taco Bell or what's that other place up there? It used to be O'Hooley's. What's that called now? Jack E.O.'s. The owners of those properties couldn't park on site, but they came to the board and asked for a variance to park on property in their same ownership, or at least one of the partners' ownership, at Electronic Vision, the old Electronic Vision, which is the Snyder Fuller office down off Depot Street. So I'm not sure how far that is, but that's one example. There have been some properties granted variance on the west side of town in particular for lease parking either at the HDL Center or the fairgrounds. So to tell you just exactly what's the furthest anyone's been able to park away from the use, I don't know that exact answer, but those are a couple examples. There was a place at the corner of not Smith, not Maple, right in that Smith Maple area off of West Washington that had lease parking down at the HDL Center. So that would be another example.
Okay. Thank you.
Questions?
I did have a question regarding the other variant. You said that this property has been before the board several times, and since I'm fairly new, since the July meeting, I'm not aware of. I mean, is that something we're allowed to talk about, or is that a
Sure, I can-
historical issue?
Now that, the first appeal on this particular property was several months ago, and it was to allow the use of this space for residential purposes by someone who did not own the property, but they happened to own the secure parking lot.
The parking that's right there adjacent to the
Right.
building?
The parking was right there.
Okay.
So it would have been off-site parking, relatively close,
Right?
but the owner of the building was not going to be the same person who had the parking.
And the board
right next
voted
door.
yes or no on that?
That was approved.
That was approved.
And I can't remember the exact roll call vote or what the vote was.
Okay.
But it was approved. 2 or 3 months later, there was another appeal, same property. The proposal was to have the additional parking that was necessary at a property in same ownership. However, it was on North Lancaster Street above 2nd Street, just about right behind the Station 1 fire
Correct.
station.
Okay.
And the board denied that application, denied that variance.
Okay.
So, and then this one, the owner is the applicant,
Right.
and will be developing the property, but just, there's no place on site to create any more parking. Or there's possibly little, but the way it's configured right now, nowhere enough space to meet the requirement.
Any other questions?
One other thing too, if you looked over the documents too, related to distances, the appellant has given a list of distances from this particular location to the proposed parking site, Morton Lecture Hall, New Baker Center, the Convo, and the Ping Center. So that might, you can compare distances
Right.
from this property to those other particular locations.
I'm just going to say, for whatever it's worth, and it may be worth nothing, I find it hard to believe that the Ping Recreation Center is farther away from this property than the Convocation Center. So I'm not sure that these are absolutely accurate figures, although they may be,
These may be, I'm not sure if these are walking distances or as the crow flies.
well, yeah.
Distances.
So, you know, if you just, yeah. So, okay,
Yeah. And the code does say that when you're measuring for deed-restricted parking, it's from the closest point on the lot
right.
as the crow flies to the closest
Right.
point on the
So-
lot. It's not the
so
actual travel distance.
Are we measuring then, are we measuring from the proposed parking spaces to these
I think what it's
buildings? Or are we measuring from the,
measuring from the
from the
proposed residence
domicile, from the residence?
to
to
these
these
other particular
spaces.
locations,
Okay, whatever. Okay.
As the crow flies.
as the crow
And-
flies,
yeah,
that's correct.
And once again, you know, the Morton Hall is certainly closer than the Ping Center, and whatever, okay.
Thank you, Steve. Any
welcome.
other questions? Roger? At this point, Mr. Wasserman, if you would please step forward. Mention your name and address, please, for the records.
My name is Rick Wasserman. I'm the owner of Wasserman Group LLC. I live at 1296 Vanderhoof Road in Coolville, and I do business at 38 North Court Street here in Athens. Do I just go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
Oh,
my
swear.
papers don't fall down here. First of all, thank you for hearing my case. Very much appreciate the opportunity to come before you and talk to you about my building. I am the owner of the land and building at 38 North Court Street, more commonly known, I think, as the Pigskin Building. I think the board is probably tired of hearing appeals related to this building. This, as Steve mentioned, will be the third one that you've heard in the last year. One was successful, one was not. This will perhaps be the tiebreaker. One of the key differences is that in each of the past two appeals, the appellant was not the owner of the building. They were basically real estate speculators, hoping to take a distressed property and turn it into the chicken that could lay the golden egg. Neither of them went ahead and bought the property. I bought the property last spring. I bought it knowing its situation, and I'm committed to finding a way to rehab it because the building is an asset to my business, and I would like to make it an asset to the city as well. I'm hoping to improve the premises and create housing uptown on the second floor while bringing the entire building up to current housing codes and fire codes. I'm requesting relief from the board in the form of a variance to allow me to rent off-site parking to satisfy the part of the zoning code that I cannot satisfy on the premises lot itself. I do not seek to skirt or ignore or subvert the code in any way, only to comply with the spirit of its intention by providing one space per occupant that would live in the building. All the spaces would be of conforming size, easily accessible, located in an appropriate zone for parking, and will be located on the same street, in fact, as the rear exit of the building. This is a parking lot that college students routinely use every day now. The lot houses over 70 cars. The previous variance that was turned down would have had parking in a zone for which it's unintended, and it also wasn't actually a parking lot, it was a backyard that had been gravelled. So I'm hoping to use real parking that people will actually use. I hope and believe that this appeal is consistent with previous Board of Zoning Appeals cases, and I believe also consistent with the goals of the Athens Comprehensive Plan. The downtown area is zoned for mixed use, and the residential housing on the second floor meets the goal of the comprehensive plan by also relieving pressure on the surrounding neighborhoods for both housing and parking. And you can see in your packet, I believe, that this variance request has the support of the Near East Side Neighborhood Association, as evidenced by their support letter. I'm sure that you've all read the written appeal, so I suppose I'm not supposed to go through it line by line, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights, if that's all right with you, and then hopefully answer any questions that you might have. As I mentioned, I have a building that takes up almost its entire footprint. There is a small parking lot in the back. We park 5 cars there and a dumpster, but 2 of those cars are always blocked in by others, so I didn't count them toward the parking that I'd be using for this development. I counted only the 3 spaces that are easily accessible from the curb. So I think that I have what I think you folks called a practical difficulty, whereas I don't have the space on the lot to provide the parking that the code needs. You and you alone have the power to remedy the situation, and I hope to demonstrate that it's in the public interest to do so. Granting of this variance would result in each and every occupant, as I mentioned, having a dedicated parking space for their car that conforms to the size specifications of the code in a lot that's currently used every day. I believe that I'll be improving the building. When you improve a building in this day and age to house people, especially above a commercial use, that includes sprinklering the building, that includes the necessary separation for fire so that you have the certain amount of hours that it's supposed to take for flame to get from one side of the wall to the other. There is a restaurant and bar below it, and that space would be brought up to current building codes as well, including sprinklering that space. The end result would be 10 new tenants uptown, and as I said, I think that housing tenants uptown is consistent with our goals for uptown, and specifically with the comprehensive plan. I think I've shown that there's a hardship here, both mine and the community's. If you look at the photographs of the upstairs of the building, I think you can see that it's an unfortunate waste of space, and I think that there's no real good public purpose served in leaving it in that condition. I do believe that this variance would be the minimum possible to grant relief. Recent history has shown us that very few, if anyone, can rehab a building uptown without the use of some variance to address some problem that they have with their lot. Many of them relate to parking, some to distance, some to ownership, some to both of those. The board has carefully granted several variances of this type in recent years in order to effect renovations of buildings on Court and Union Streets, and I hope you'll find it in the city's interest to do so tonight as well. Some of those applicants were fortunate enough to own parking that they could use off-site. I'm not quite that fortunate, but I did go out and find a parking lot that I think is a good lot, and the owner of that parking lot, in fact, has intention to rehab it as well, and it will become a paved parking lot within the next couple of years if he gets to do what he's going to do. So yeah, I think it'll be a good situation. We talked a little bit about the distances. I kind of did that just for informational purposes. I defer to Steve. I'm not the expert at GIS that I know he is. And when I attempted to do the lot to lot, I mean, the maps on the GIS are very fine, and a couple 100 feet on there is a very, very tiny little movement of your mouse. So I attempted to do the best I could with the distances. All the distances that I listed are distances from the lot line of 38 North Court Street. So to the parking, I came up with, I think, 19 something, and Steve came up with 2,200. So we're close, but obviously I'm off a little bit. And then I did the same thing with the other ones. So my building is almost exactly the same distance from this parking as it is, for instance, from the New Baker University Center. And the only reason I'm doing that is to demonstrate that the distance is a distance that college students will walk on a routine basis every day in their lives. And I think that most of them will gladly pay that price to live uptown. I also believe that granting the variance will actually increase the surrounding property values, because the building now is pretty well regarded as an eyesore. Not just if you've walked around inside, the outside and the facade have not been well taken care of. It features a number of, I think what they call aesthetically insensitive details to the period that the building was built in. And I'm hoping to address all of that in the scope of a renovation. But any renovation requires bringing the building up to code, and that's an expensive proposition. And without the revenue stream that I would get from having the second floor as a residential occupancy, it would be very, very difficult to do that. So there isn't much else that I can say. I would like to just draw your attention one more time to the photographs that I presented with my appeal, which are laid out there. I think more than anything, the photos show what a waste the upstairs of the building has become. I've been a tenant of the building for 11 years before I was given the opportunity to buy the building. So I've witnessed the deferred maintenance and you know, there are a lot of problems up there, and I hope that we could all agree that what's become of this space isn't really good for anyone, and it couldn't have been the intention of any city council to force successive building owners to leave it in this condition. And I'm really, really hoping that, you know, in addition to building something that I think would provide my family and I with a good income, will also do something good for the city and taking care of what is clearly an eyesore and a possible attraction for vandalism. And I mentioned in the thing that I wrote, the appeal that I wrote, that in a conversation with the fire chief, he also indicated that clearly a building that's unoccupied is much more of a risk for fire than a building that's occupied. And, you know, so I'm hoping that that's one of the things we'll be able to address. That was all I wanted to say. I hope that you'll have questions and I'll be able to answer them.
I have a question about possible uses for the first floor.
For the first floor?
Yeah, does your business occupy all of the first floor? or
My
will you be
business
talking-
occupies about 80% of the first floor. The other
Okay.
side of it is rented to a store called Bali Karma.
Okay.
They
so
moved in
you-
about a month ago.
Yeah.
And they, it used to be the Wilson Camera Store.
Yeah.
And he moved the camera store out about a year or so ago. And Bali Karma moved in there about a month and a half.
Okay, so you have tenants, yourself and others, for the
Yes, ma'am.
downstairs? Okay.
Yes. And we occupy the basement as well as the
Okay.
first floor.
The board may decide to add a condition to this variance that if it's granted, you know, it would be void if you lose the lease to those parking spaces. So it's something that you're aware of it, right?
Yes, I understand that, and the lease that I've worked out with the folks who own the building is for 20 years.
Okay. And there was no other spaces closer to your property, was it? That you
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say in this forum. There are spaces closer, certainly, but to rent them would be from renting from people who would be competitors, shall we say, in the housing market, and so it's not in their interest to rent them, and they won't rent them. And believe me, I called virtually every property owner in the uptown area, and it's a tough go, because anyone, the names that you know who own properties in the area are all the folks who own those parking lots uptown, and they're the biggest landlords in Athens, and it's not in their interest to rent them.
So the variance, when the variance, there was, you were not working together at that point when that other variance occurred.
Well, I wasn't involved at all because I was merely a tenant in the building. When the variance that was passed about a year ago came to pass, there was going to be a working relationship between the owners of the secure parking lot and the then landlord, Bob Wilson. And I had discussions with the secure parking lot folks as well, but no equitable deal could be reached. I mean, they wanted to own the apartments outright, and there wasn't really any financial benefit for the building owner there.
Well, and though the parking lot owner on Mill Street is willing to give you a deal for 20 years, we have no assurance, of course, that he will continue to own the lot for the next 20 years.
Well, typically a lease survives
Okay.
ownership. So in other words, when it looked like someone else was
Right.
going to buy my building, I was secure in the knowledge that at least for the remainder of my lease, I'd be able to stay there under those current terms, regardless of who owned the
I
building.
guess I'm thinking of the person who owns the parking lot actually selling the lot and somebody deciding to build something on it other than a parking lot.
Right. Well, I think that's already happened because, and I don't want to speak out of school here, but apparently there is a development being considered by the current owner on there that would still have enough parking left over for his development as well as the 7 spaces that I need. So that's how the lot's going to get paved. If they end up building a
Nice.
building, the lot will get paved.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Mr. Wasserman. You will have a chance to maybe make additional comments if you need.
Thank you so much.
We don't have anyone in here to be speaking for or opposing or in general comment. Unless Dan, you want to say something? Steve, you want to?
Excuse me, the code says that in granting a variance, the board can attach any conditions and safeguards necessary to, guarantee the intent of the variance. So for example, you could say, if the parking was ever removed or diminished,
On the-
relinquished, whatever, at this particular place, that would automatically void the variance and require a rehearing. So that's one example. You can't attach safeguards and conditions.
So we could say if it was terminated,
What if it was replaced by 7 other spaces somewhere else?
Would we
Is-
still
then,
have, that
would
was
have
my
to be
then
question.
it'd be, that's
Right.
what we'd
I
want.
would think that that would be something the board would also want to look at. Because if you just say it's okay to replace 7 with 7 others,
Some at University Park Mall for
But it'd be
whatever.
subject to our approval, wouldn't
Yeah.
it?
that's correct.
Yeah.
Presumably.
That's not unsimilar to, I think at your last meeting, there was a variance granted long ago that had quite a few attached conditions. And the code does allow for those to safeguard essentially the integrity of the variance and the public interest. So that's just a comment on that. How do you know for sure that that parking will always, go with that particular use?
Okay, thank you.
So, and I have heard about some plans to do additional development at 175 Mill. And so as long as, it'll always be in the record, but for as long as I'm here, if I see 175 Mill, I'll know, it's not only their parking that they need, plus 7 other spaces. This one's a little different. Normally, it's related, I tell you, I take that back, too. There's finally going to be an application for a rental housing permit, and so this variance will be contained in that file, and no matter who's working for the city, whoever the zoning administrator is, or a code enforcement or housing officer, every time that there's an inspection due, which is either every 2 years or on complaint, when that file's opened up to code office, and they're getting close to 4,900 files right now, 4,900 addresses at the code office. That officer who's responsible for that area will see the variance, see the resolution, and he'll know when he goes to do that inspection to make sure that contained in the file is a current copy of a lease. So it's not completely foolproof, but there are lots of different overlapping checks and balances.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Wasserman, you want to add any more? Okay, thank you. Now the discussion from the floor is closed, and anything we need to discuss among ourselves, or should somebody maybe make a motion? With attached condition that if,
Well, certainly,
Maybe we want to talk about it a
Sure.
little bit before we
Yeah.
Go
make
ahead.
this motion. I mean, usually we make the motion and then talk through the findings, but do you want to talk about the last 2 cases about this property some more for the new people on the board?
my comment.
Why did we grant it the first time, and why did we deny it the second time?
Right.
We probably should have had those minutes with us tonight so that we could be more sure of what we were doing, but
I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, I wish everybody could play together in the sandbox.
sure, right.
Because
Right.
everyone there in that area is all living and working
Right.
together, and you wish that
I
that could
think
happen.
Mr. Wasserman covered that to some degree. He remarked about the fact that the people that they were talking about leasing it,
Competitor.
not owning it, and owning the rental, or the
Building.
parking spaces.
So the first time around,
That was the first.
there was going to be parking in the secure parking lot, right,
For the
practically on
building,
the
for the
site.
project.
But they were only going to lease it. They weren't going to own the building.
Right.
They were going to own the parking lots, but not the building.
Is that correct? I thought actually that they owned both of them.
Well, then I'm confused because the way Mr. Wasserman was talking, it was as if there was no, maybe I misunderstood that.
Well, it wasn't the first person who came to us Guy Phillips?
Yeah.
Okay, so Guy Phillips came.
Right, Guy
and
Phillips
he-
came, and at the time, Mr. Wilson still owned the building, and at that time, as I recall, did not want to sell the building.
Okay,
He simply wanted to lease the space.
leased the building.
Right.
Okay,
Have it redone or
okay. So,
up-
so presumably Mr. Phillips was going to lease the building, and he also owned the parking lot. So
That's
that
correct.
the two things would be not literally in the same ownership, but at least the person who was
The
leasing the
parking.
building owned the parking, and it was right there on site. Second time around, the person who came
There
for
was
the
a
building-
proposal to, by that time, I believe Mr. Wilson had offered the building for sale, and the appellant was a person who, or a group that wanted to purchase the building, but not until they saw if they could get a parking variance.
Right. And in fact, they couldn't get a parking variance because they didn't have access, probably because of the competition or something, at the secure parking lot, and so they were proposing parking up
On their
to
own property,
2nd Street on their own property, which is,
quite a distance.
you know,
Oh, goodness, yes, I know that is.
it's walkable, certainly,
Right.
but it was up the hill and around the corner, so the question was, are students really gonna park their
And it
cars
wasn't
and
a
walk home?
recognized parking lot. It
Right.
was a backyard
Right.
of a house and a
Right.
shared driveway even.
Right. So we turned that one down. Now here we're back again.
Well, this certainly is more accessible,
Yeah.
apparently.
It's a lot different.
Well, yes, it is more accessible and it is an unpaved parking lot.
And it's the
It is some
owner,
distance away.
and it's the owner that's requesting it.
The owner of the building was
Yeah.
requesting it, yes. I'm not sure how much difference I think that makes, but the parking will be not quite a mile away, but a hike.
And I'd certainly be willing to approve it if we could be certain that those parking spaces would be dedicated to that property. And if something would happen to the parking, then they'd have to come before the board again.
Well, there's no assurance that somebody goes in there and finds there is no space unless they are clearly marked for your use of property.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the condition of the parking lot is not,
It's a pretty substandard parking lot.
yeah.
It is a parking lot, certainly, it's in my neighborhood. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that here is a building that's occupied on the first floor and the space upstairs needs to be rehabbed, and we have somebody who's willing to rehab it, and so potentially that seems to be an attractive situation. It would be maybe safer or
It
better or
would
more
absolutely be
attractive.
safer from a fire standpoint.
Right. However, I have ringing in my ears Councilwoman Nancy Bain's comment published in the Athens Messenger that said the parking problems in Athens are laid at the feet of the Athens Zoning Board of Appeals, which constantly gives people variances when presumably they should not. So those are the things you might
But we're
also
not-
consider.
We're not precluding parking. We're saying that parking has to be provided. I mean, I
However-
can see where Ms. Bain would be upset if we just said, sure, go ahead, 3 spaces are enough, you can
She
put in 10
suggested
parking.
that's what we do.
And we do.
And not wanting to mention that, I took offense because that's city council's job to come up with laws. So it's actually, she can throw it at our feet. But those
Well, I
guys, if
sort
they
of
did
wanted
their
to call and
job,
say, what about your job? But,
if they did their job, he wouldn't have to be here.
and I wouldn't say this publicly, except her comments were public, so.
And that's what we are here for, you know, so,
So I guess we have to look at the findings and not just,
exactly.
is this going to be a good thing for this building and perhaps uptown, or does it fit the findings?
I'm with your first comments. I think it's the first time the owner of the building has come, not people who are speculating.
I don't know that that makes so great a
And,
difference.
Well, I think it makes a big difference.
Well, they don't own the parking lot, so they have not control of that.
Well, the one did the speculation and got the zoning variance for the parking lot, but he had no control over the building other than possibly renting it later on.
So what real difference does it make that he has control over the building?
Because he owns the building.
You have a
He's-
vested
And so-
He's
interest.
got a vested interest.
He has a vested interest in
And-
renting the properties, but what else does he have a vested
Well,
interest
if he's gonna
in?
put the sprinklers in it, and we saw the property, what it looks like upstairs.
Okay, as I said, I'm very sympathetic to all that, but my question is, when we look at the findings, will we find for the findings, and will that, or are we just finding because this will be a better building?
Well, then, let's make a motion and go to the findings.
All right, let's do that. I'll make the motion. Okay, I move that we grant a variance to the property at 38 North Court Street. The Wasserman Group, LLC, is the appellant. To a variance from Section 2311, Table B, off-street parking, to permit residential occupancy of a structure with 3 on-site and 7 off-site parking spaces, where 10 parking spaces are required. The 7 off-site parking spaces to be located at 175 Mill Street, with the condition that they be clearly specified as intended for and provided for, and excluding all others for Mr. Wasserman's tenants, and with the condition that should conditions at that parking lot change at all, that Mr. Wasserman would need, or the owner of the building at 38 Court Street, would need to return to the zoning board to have the case reheard to see if the conditions would be still satisfactorily met.
I second.
Okay. Practical difficulty and undue hardship. Because of exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions pertaining to a specific piece of property, the literal enforcement of these regulations will result in practical difficulty or undue hardship that is unnecessary to the achievement of the public purposes. Do we have a hardship here?
Well, I think every time I read this, I really need to think about it. What it really says is, does literal enforcement of the code create an undue hardship that is not necessary to the achievement of public purposes? It's not just, is there a hardship, but are we creating a hardship that is unnecessary through literal enforcement of the code? So, if we stick to the terms of the code, does that make an unnecessary hardship for Mr. Wasserman? Unnecessary in terms of what the code is intended to
And the
do.
code wants to make certain that we have parking for the,
At reasonable distances.
exactly.
So that people would actually use the
Mhm.
parking spaces that are provided for them, instead
and
of just saying,
there
well,
again,
we're really
what's the
tired tonight.
interpretation of a reasonable distance? Is that 20
250
feet or
250 feet specifically,
feet
as
or
implied, by it's stated by
3,000
the,
feet?
it's 250 as the code states.
It's a code state?
This is 220.
Let's
or
say, how long
200,
does it take for
2,000.
someone to walk 2,200 feet? Is
It takes
2
10
minutes, 5
minutes.
minutes, 10
It's
minutes?
not, it's not a matter
Yeah,
really
but just,
of the
I mean,
distance.
reasonable.
It's whether on a late night when you're parking your car, is it easier to park on Court Street in front of the building or to walk up the hill?
Or if you want to carry groceries or something.
Leave
Sure.
your car on Court Street overnight?
Sure.
and you can-
Well,
Right.
yeah, walking up Mill Street at night could be difficult or unsafe, possible.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say unsafe, because that's one of the streets that's patrolled quite constantly by OUPD and Athens PD. However, I think it would create a hardship. We're landlocked. I mean, and we're public parking space locked. I think it's reasonable. It would have been nice if we'd got something closer, but I think it would be reasonable because most of the students who live uptown very seldom take their cars out and go driving around the neighborhood and come back and walk around. I think some of the students that I know, they take their cars home on a weekend because they got part-time jobs home,
Yep.
or they're taking care of their mother and father. Most of the time, they'll just come, park the car, and leave it.
Okay.
What if you designate, like, require that one of those 3 spaces to be designated for maybe loading, unloading?
No, I don't think you can do that, because then you've designated that for loading, and then you've eliminated one, so then you
And if
need
the
8 down the
vehicles are
hill.
pulled clear up into parking spaces, he's still gonna have 2 spaces
would
that
be
can be
more messed
used
up.
for loading and unloading.
So, okay, any more comments on the first one? Exceptional circumstances. There are exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions applying to the property, in question or to the intended use of the property that do not apply generally to other properties or classes or uses in the same zone.
I think that was answered when we asked if there was precedent, and Steve mentioned that there is precedent here.
Well, I don't think
Gave us
that's-
2 or 3 examples of that.
I don't think that's the issue. It seems to me, well, maybe it is one of the issues. I guess I'm seeing another thing. A lot of the buildings, as was pointed out, uptown, are grandfathered. However,
You like that,
You-
however.
what?
You like that, however.
However, yeah, it gives you time to think slowly. If everybody else is grandfathered, then you think, well, gosh, these people should have the same right too. But the reason those are grandfathered and these others are not is because they were probably grandfathered when the code came in '68, because they were already as they were. In the meantime, buildings that used to really house businesses have become residential, which creates a different kind of a problem. And it does leave Mr. Wasserman or other people who are in this circumstance sort of out on a limb, in some ways without the same privileges. However, you can't keep going back and back and back, in my opinion, to what used to be if you now have different laws and different circumstances governing the downtown properties. So I would suggest that that's one of the things that I'm thinking about.
What I've been curious about all along, this is just a general observation, you've got this space up above this business building and you're not allowed to use it for anything but maybe storage?
Surely there's something else.
There ought to be some way to utilize it in a fashion that would create an income, because after all, it is a
Well,
tax-paying piece of real
Well,
estate.
and also to preserve the building. I'm sympathetic to that.
Okay, preservation of equal property rights. Literal interpretation of these regulations would deprive the appellant of rights commonly enjoyed by the others in the same zone and the same vicinity. Now, while the granting of the requested variance will not confer on the appellant any special privilege that is denied to other properties in the same zone and the same vicinity. Again, this goes with the second one in terms of granting this variance. Obviously, it will grant some additional privilege to this property and property owner. But the same situation exists for the other building that go for rehab eventually. They will be facing the same problems.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the Woolworth building, which I'm sure you guys have
We've
been here many times, and I think of that space that is sat empty. And
But it's not
there's a lot
because
it's
of
not
us.
parking.
We heard that case 3 times, denied it twice, and finally were literally pressured by many people into granting that variance, but not until the owner of the property bought a parking lot within reasonable distance of that property. She did in fact find a parking lot on, I believe, Congress Street. It's a little bit past the 250-foot thing, but she did buy a parking lot, and it was at that point that we granted her the variance. And she chooses to keep it empty.
And those are apartments all over there.
The apartments require the parking and have it. She just hasn't done anything else with the property, either because she can't or because she's not interested in doing it.
I think, for me, we're this particular one, are we denying him equal rights? In a way, yes, because if I go around and buy all the parking spaces in town, I got a monopoly. And if the city council wants to extend that 250, they can do that. I think that's their legislation.
Something they could consider, certainly.
I think it's unlikely that they would change it very much, because you want people to use the parking that's provided and not just have it in name and then have people actually parking closer because they can on the street.
Well, if I have and I had places where I had to park. I knew my space. I did park in my space most of the time.
Most of the time.
There were sometimes I parked down the middle on Locusts, and I knew I was going to get ticketed in the
Right.
morning. Most of the time I did park. And that's basically, but 250 in a way, We are preventing him from equal rights because a lot of the other places that are not rehab, that are looking like crap, that are deteriorating right before our eyes, nobody wants to touch it. I think with his putting sprinkler systems just over a stove will cost you between $25,000 and $5,000, just one over a stove. Imagine what he's going to do to the whole building.
Right.
So I do think, in a way, I mean, it's slighted, but we are preventing him from seeing his full investment.
Maybe what you have to decide, is it us or is it the code?
I think right now it's a code.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Minimum variance. The variance granted is the minimum variance required to make possible the reasonable use of the property. What is the reasonable use of the property? Could it be done with 3-4 people? Or
Well, it doesn't even have to have residences upstairs.
Yeah.
No,
There are
it
two
can be kept
businesses
the way it is.
downstairs. Yeah, there are two businesses downstairs.
Too bad the public can't see how nice our buildings look like
Yeah,
up
but
above the
also,
business
remember, he
buildings.
said the outside, he was going to also work on the outside.
Right,
And he said
yeah,
something- he alluded to the fact working with the Historical Society and bringing it back up.
Yeah.
That's going to quite a bit of money.
I don't, again, is it really the amount of money that's going to be spent on it, or is it the minimum variance? Is it,
Could be the minimum
what's a
variance.
reasonable use of the building?
It's going to be a big improvement.
Go.
Okay. I'm not getting anything out of each one of this. Absence of detriment. The authorizing of such variance will not be of substantial detriment to adjacent property and will not materially impair the purpose of the zoning code or the public interest.
It sure won't be a detriment to the adjoining properties because it'll enhance them by
Yes, it will.
being a lot more
Right. It will.
desirable.
It would be an improvement. And not of a general nature. The condition or situation of the specific piece of property or the intended use of said property for which variance is sought is not of a so general or recurrent in nature as to make reasonably practicable the formulation of a general regulation for such condition or situation.
No,
I guess the answer is
no
no.
problem.
Any further discussion before we vote? Well, we start with you, Betty.
Okay, I'm going to vote no.
I'm going to vote yes.
Yes, with stipulations on that lease.
Well, she made that in
Oh,
the,
did she put that?
Yeah.
Yes.
What did I say?
You?
Yes.
Okay, we have 3 yeses, and I'm gonna vote no as well, so would be, you have the variance,
Okay,
3-2.
congratulations.
Next item.
Yeah, next item, I was not here last month, and you,
Yeah, I move that we accept the minutes as presented.
I second it.
all in favor?
Aye.
Okay,
Done?
they are accepted. Is there,
If I could. I don't know if you recall or not, the last meeting when the room became very tense. And this has happened at Board of Zoning Appeals meetings on several occasions. And you know, the City of Athens is glad that you volunteered to do this service, and we also want to protect you as much as we possibly can from any kind of harm that may come as a board member, especially while we're in this room. So one of the things that we can do, if it's all right with you, is to actually have you sit at the podium like council does, to create a little more separation between you and the audience. Council, there is a reason other than just to get them higher up off the floor for this podium.
there's a escape door back there somewhere?
Slide down the.
There's a lot more distance and a bigger wall between you and someone who might be upset. And there are several different ways that the city provides security in this room. People are watching this at home. They may be watching it over at the police department. They may be listening to what's, what I'm saying. There is, because there's security with every, especially city council, or with the planning commission. I mean, the next planning commission meeting, I might recommend that they do the same thing. Sit up at the podium rather than on the floor. The tree commission likes to sit down rather than up here, but I'm just looking at it in terms of security and safety. So
Don't change anything. It'd be a good thing to do.
I don't see
we
fair way
can,
to sit.
yeah. And I've already talked to Scott Thompson, the government channel. Like now, they have these turnaround backwards.
You mean they'll have to make names for us? Oh, my. It will be our perk instead of the membership. we try
And
to
then
get for
when we
us.
retire, we get to take that with us, right?
You got to give me the parking pass back, though.
Oh,
I have the parking
I'll
pass
trade
back.
you parking pass for the nameplate.
Another thing, too, I believe the government channel is, we've talked about this for quite a while, working on like an opening segment where the members will be introduced and that whole big, long intro will be read. I believe there's an intern working on that right now. And so there'll actually be an introduction,
Sure be nice.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's still in the works, and I've reminded
That would be
people from the
nice, like
government channel.
ADA, you don't have to read it every time, it's always posted.
Right.
Exactly. And that was another thing, too. If you noticed tonight, I revised your introductory statement because there's been some question about announcing to the public if they have some kind of accessibility or handicap requirement where they need special accommodation in this room. It's always been on the legal notices, it's always been on the agenda, it's always been on the notices that went out to the appellant and the parties of interest. So I just added it to that introductory statement. The room can hold, we're just looking at this, 94 people are allowed to occupy this room, so that's actually quite a few people, and you can tell from the last meeting, it got pretty close, literally close. So just want to
And it
do
was
everything we
warm.
can to protect you as possible. Tonight, it seems like tonight's so calm and relaxed compared to the last meeting, but it does on occasion become, these things become heated and controversial, so we'll get some nameplates made up. We'll go up there next time. At least that's one bit of, safety and security that we can easily accomplish. And there are other things that amongst the administration we're talking about.
Thank you, Steve, for caring about
Thank you.
us.
Motion to adjourn?
Yes.
Yes. Second.